Good morning. Thank you all for choosing to be here with us this morning. If you're a visitor, we're glad you chose to be here. Give us a chance to maybe stick around afterwards and let us get to know you. Now, we're going to be continuing our sermon on our series on grace. And last week, we talked about the book of Genesis. This week, we're going to talk about Exodus. So if you want to be turning there, if you want to follow along, you can go ahead and turn the book of Exodus. And I promise, I'm not going to go through every book in the Old Testament. All right? I'll go ahead and say that up front. I know it may seem like that when you see my topic for today. But I promise it's just certain books tend to have a lot of things about grace in it, and the bigger picture kind of lends to that. And so that's why we're doing this again today. So as we talk about the book of Exodus, remember it's right after Genesis. Genesis left off with Joseph and his family now all living in Egypt. And essentially that's where it's left off. And we talked about how God has chosen this family, even though they have their flaws, even though they have their mistakes, and they continue to have these flaws and mistakes. God starts to work through this family that we know as the Israelites. Well, Exodus starts off kind of where that left off. Not exactly, but about 400 years after is where Exodus picks up. And I want to run through the story and then we'll step back and look at some things. But the first thing that happens is Pharaoh, this leader over Egypt, he fears Israel. We find out that Israel grows, that they multiply. And so this immigrant kind of nation that's living inside of Egypt, Pharaoh starts to become fearful of. And so he starts to oppress them, and he does several bad things really just to try to beat them down, and that doesn't work. And God, Israel first, they cry out to God because of this oppression, and God hears them. And because of the covenant that He made, He decides to rescue them, and He does so. And then after that, after He's rescued, God then calls the people of Israel to Mount Sinai, where they meet with God, and God establishes this covenant. He gives them what we know as the 10 Commandments or the 10 words. And then He gives them a bunch of other things that says, this is how you are to live. If you're going to be my people, if you're going to be in this covenant agreement with me, this is what that means. Then unfortunately, Israel breaks that covenant. And then after the breaking of that covenant, God kind of does this interesting little thing with Moses. And we don't have time to go into it today, but basically it seems like He's testing Moses to see if Moses really is following God and being the leader that God wants him to be. And then after that, God renews the covenant. And then they build the tabernacle. And Exodus ends with the tabernacle being built, but yet nobody being able to come in. And that's where the book of Leviticus picks up. But that's the overall story of the book of Exodus. Now, I may have missed a few details, but I want you to have the big picture, because what we're going to do is we're going to look at two specific characters in this book. And I think really this is going to help us to bring out this idea of grace when we look at these two characters. Because I think it's going to show you that if God can show grace in these circumstances, then He can show grace to all of us. And the first one we're going to look at is Pharaoh himself. Now, Pharaoh, I said, he was threatened by these immigrants that were in his kingdom, and he wanted to do something about it. And it starts off in chapter 1, it says, arose a new king over Egypt. So this new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, which I think is more just, lack of memory, whatever it is, but it's also symbolic that he doesn't remember the good things that the people of Israel have done for him. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel, they're too many and they're too mighty for us. He says, we should be afraid of them, because if we're not careful, they're going to overthrow us. They have this power. And so he sets out with this plan to try to cut down on the numbers of Israel. And he tells all the midwives apparently served both Egyptians and Israelites. And so he tells them all, he says, hey, when you serve as a midwife to these Hebrew women, and you see them on the birth stool, if it's a son, kill him. But if it's a daughter, the daughter can live. But if it's a son, kill him. Now, God's not going to let somebody just overcome him this easy. And actually we find out that the midwives, they fear God. And so instead, they don't kill these. And so Pharaoh gets mad, and he comes back to him and he tells him a second time, he says, hey, every son that is born to the Hebrews, cast him into the Nile. He gives them specific orders, not just generically, get rid of him, but instead cast him into the Nile. But every daughter can live. So Pharaoh, You know, we just got out of the book of Genesis where humanity decided to define good and evil for themselves. And that's really what brings about this sin and this evil. And here we see a person who rules a nation and is starting to define good and evil for himself. It's good that the Israelites are cut down in number. It's good that we kill all the boys so that they don't take us over. He's defining good and evil for himself. Now, the great thing about this story, and shows how God is still sovereign over all, is He's the one that gave the order for then Moses to be cast into the Nile. But they didn't cast the way that he thought he was going to cast. Instead, they put him in a basket. And they make sure that the basket, can float and all this. And they put Moses in this basket, being a Hebrew-born son. And he goes down the Nile, and guess where he ends up? In Pharaoh's own house. Pharaoh was so determined to overcome God and His people, but yet God flips that on the head to where now he has a Hebrew son living in his house. The very one that he told him to cast in the Nile. He told him to kill him, but instead, he's now got this new life living in Pharaoh's own house. Now, Pharaoh doesn't stop at just trying to kill all the firstborn sons. In fact, Pharaoh does many things to try to oppress them. And one of them is he tells the people that are, because they're slaves, he tells them, work them hard. And we even get this story where it just gets worse, and they even ramp it up. He says, look, don't even give them the straw to make bricks. Have them go out and get their own straw. And he continues to pour on and oppress them because he's thinking, hey, if I can work them hard, if I can exhaust them, they can't revolt. They can't overthrow me. Exodus 4:21. At this point, God starts to act. And he's talking to Moses, and he's called Moses, and like I say, the very son that is now living in Pharaoh's house. He calls him, and there's this story of Moses, and we're not going to get into that, but when he starts to come back, God says to him, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I've put in your power. And he tells him this thing, and really this is what I want us to spend our time focusing on, because I think this is easily misunderstood. But he says, I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Now, if you know much about the book of Exodus, this is actually a very common phrase and idea, and it really kind of seems to be a theme throughout the book. And really, we don't see this in a lot of other books. It's kind of special to the book of Exodus. And if you look at, he actually says this 4 different times. He says, I will harden the heart of Pharaoh. In chapter 7, in chapter 10, and chapter 14, 4 different times, God tells Moses, I'm going to harden his heart. This idea pops up a lot though. So, God says He will harden his heart, but there's actually this idea, and it says 3 different times that Pharaoh hardens his own heart. And then after that, we're told specific times where it says God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And a lot of this can be confusing, but I want us to really look at the timeline of how this plays out. I want us to look at exactly what is going on here because, amazingly, I think we can see some grace in this. It starts out that really, if you look at the first time where it says that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. So he predicted it in chapter 4 and again in chapter 7. But the first time that it actually says that God hardens Pharaoh's heart is after the 6th of the plagues. I don't know if I didn't really say that earlier, but the 10 plagues, right? These things that God does to the Egyptians to show His power and to show that God is sovereign and to really try to get through to them. And this is the way that He then calls them out and drives His people out of Egypt. But yet, after the 6th one, that's where it said God's hardened His heart. Think about all the things that have happened before this, right? But we know that Pharaoh's heart was hard even before the first plague. Chapter 5 in verse 1 and 2 it says, Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, Thus says the Lord the God to Israel, Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. That's the request. That's what they want. But yet Pharaoh responds and says, Who is the Lord that I should obey His voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. Before any plague has happened, before any amazing, powerful thing that God has tried to demonstrate His sovereignty with. None of that has happened. And yet at the very beginning of this, Pharaoh says, who's this Lord? Like I'm going to listen to Him. I'm king of Egypt. I don't have to listen to Him. I don't need to obey this Yahweh that you speak of. I don't even know this Yahweh. Before it even starts, his heart is hard. But that's not it. In fact, we see after 2 of the plagues in chapter 8, Pharaoh hardens his heart even more. The book of Exodus tells us, he doesn't just continue to think this kind of naive thought that he says in chapter 5, but instead, he hardens his heart. He says, I don't want to listen. I don't care if this Yahweh can do these things. I don't want to obey this Yahweh. But I want you to see some of the things that happen between chapter 5 and chapter 9 when God hardens his heart. The first thing that happened is that it happened twice before chapter 9, but every time that Pharaoh says, Moses, please go plead to Yahweh. I was wrong. Plead to Him to take the plague away. Twice, God takes it away. And then Pharaoh says, psych, you can't go. Twice. Such a childish thing, but yet twice, God actually takes the plague away knowing that He's just going to say psych and say never mind. Not only that, the first couple of plagues, their magicians were able to do the very thing that God did, or at least seem like it. But yet, it comes to the point where they can't do it anymore. The magicians, they no longer could do it. And so, he sees that, okay, well, we can do this. But eventually it gets to the point, no man is able to do what God is doing now. Not only that, it eventually gets to the point, before his heart's ever hard, that all the plagues only happen to the Egyptians. The Israelites, at that point, God starts to make a distinction. He says, look, I'm going to make it as clear as possible. Those that follow me, those that obey me, they don't even have to deal with the plagues. But yet those that aren't called by my name, you're going to have to deal with the plagues. All of these things happen before God ever hardens His heart. And on top of that, we see signs that other people, other than Pharaoh, they start to humble themselves. In chapter 8, verse 19, I mentioned the magicians. They got to the point they couldn't do it. And so they tell Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. They try to tell him flat out, look, we can't do this. What you're seeing is the very finger of God. But then it says right after that, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. God knew it was going to happen. God knew Pharaoh's heart was already hard. He's telling them, even though other people will humble, Pharaoh will not. Not only that, later, after God starts to harden Pharaoh's heart, we see other stories of people that humble themselves. The first is, they predict this hail. Moses says, look, God's going to bring down hail on the land. It's going to destroy all these things. And it says that those that feared the word of the Lord, they went to their slaves and livestock and they brought them into the house. But whoever did not pay attention to the word of the Lord left his slaves and his livestock in the field. There were Egyptians who said, hey, no, that Moses guy, he's speaking for God. He says it's going to hail, it's going to hail. I'm going to bring all my people inside. But Pharaoh says, nope. Other people were starting to believe. And then finally in chapter 10, verse 7, Pharaoh's servants say to him, Pharaoh just is hard-headed and they know it. And he doesn't seem to want to give at all. And they say to him, how long shall this man, Moses, be a snare to us? Let them may go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not understand that Egypt is ruined? Even his own servants are starting to say, Pharaoh, you are ruining our kingdom with your hard-headedness, with your hard heart. Other people can see it, but Pharaoh does not. Now, it gets to the point. Pharaoh's heart is so hard that God continues to harden his heart. And God actually says He does this so that He can multiply His wonders. So that He can do things that people look and say, that is God. You think about the different things that happen. And for the people of Israel, Passover becomes such this big thing. But really, Passover is a story of people who lost their firstborn son because they didn't obey God. Because they didn't fear God. Because they didn't do what God wanted them to do. And yet the people of Israel become known by this thing where we obeyed God. And God spared us. He had mercy. He had grace. But the crazy thing about this story is that although God knew that He was going to have to harden Pharaoh's heart, although He knew He was going to make him so hard-headed and stubborn that his wonders would be multiplied, He gave him 5 plagues and many other signs and other people changing their mind to give Pharaoh a second chance. God didn't harden his heart until after the 6th plague. He gave him that long. And we don't understand this, and I don't claim to understand this, but apparently God knew that Pharaoh was still going to reject him. Even after all those chances, even though God is not the one hardening his heart, even though God is showing these miraculous signs and other people are starting to fear Yahweh, He gave him a chance. But God knew He was eventually going to have to finish it out. It's amazing that God still gave a chance to Pharaoh. I mean, think about what He did to the Israelites. He was killing every son. Now, we look at that and it's hard to even imagine. We kids, innocent, brand new, born children. And even the interaction with them in their work is they come and they complain, and He's like, well, you're being lazy. Get back out there and work. He has so much hatred built up towards God's people. And yet God still gave him a chance. That's the first story I wanted to look at. Now the second one is the Israelites. The Israelites themselves. And this is really where we start to see ourselves in this story, because we know that through the Old Testament that really we are the Israelites. We are God's people. He has chosen us, and He's given us this option of this covenant. And when we start to follow as Christians, when we start to do this, we're really putting ourselves in the shoes of the Israelites. We are following God, and we can see ourselves in these stories. And you think about how this starts for them. And it starts in a really just showing you God's love and grace. Is that in chapter 2, when this oppression happens, they cry out to God. And in verse 24 it says, God heard their groaning, and God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob. And remember, from Genesis, it's not that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were these amazing people, that they achieved some sort of status, and God's like, oh yeah, you're here, now I'm going to agree this covenant with. No, these were broken and flawed people too. So what really is happening here is God is remembering that He committed to these people. Even though they were flawed, even though they make mistakes, God remembered, these are my people. And what's amazing about verse 24 is not Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the covenant that God has made. And yet here it is. People are crying out, and God remembers this. He remembers the commitment and the covenant that He made to the family of Abraham. So God comes to their rescue. And then we have the story of Moses being called shortly thereafter. And then, just like we talked about a second ago, Moses finally comes in. And he tells the people of Israel, he says, God has spoken to me. God appeared in this burning bush, and He's told me that He's going to rescue us, that He is going to bring us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, that He's going to overcome Pharaoh, and we're going to be led to this land of milk and honey. And it says the people believed. And they heard that the Lord had visited Israel, that they had seen their affliction, and they bowed their heads, and they worshiped. And you can see with my little word up there, this is about to get really complicated. And I want you to keep track of this, because right here, this is a high point. God's heard their cry. God speaks through Moses, and He says, all right, I'm going to rescue you. And now, they believe it. And they're excited and they worship and they're happy. But then Moses goes into Pharaoh. And says, Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, what? Okay, I'm not working y'all hard enough. And he works them harder. And then shortly thereafter, look at how the people are. The Lord, look on you. This is what they say to Moses. The Lord, look on you and judge, because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. He said, yeah, you went and spoke to Pharaoh, and all that did is that made Pharaoh and want to kill us. He doesn't like us now because of you, Moses. A chapter earlier, they were happy, they were rejoicing, they were worshiping because God was going to rescue them. And then as soon as Pharaoh gets, his heart hardens and he just looks at them and he says, y'all got to work harder. That's all it is. And immediately their response is, oh, Moses, you ruined it now. You went in and, we had it okay. We were fine with what we had. And you went and you upset the apple cart, and now things are worse. And you go stand before God and you be judged. How could you, Moses? There we go. But God doesn't stop there. And He speaks to Moses and He says, go to the people of Israel. And He says, I will bring you. So he's telling them exactly what He's going to do. I was wrong. It doesn't happen yet. But He tells them the exactness of what's going to happen. He says, I'm going to bring you out with these acts of judgment. So they were discouraged that Pharaoh's now mad at him. And so He tells them this plan. He says, I will take you to be my people and be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord who has brought you out from the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into the land. So he lays out that plan like I just mentioned. Moses spoke to us, the people of Israel. But here's the thing. They didn't listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and the harsh slavery. They were excited when all the status quo was the same. But then Moses had to mess things up and go speak to Pharaoh. And Moses tries to reassure them. But they're so discouraged from the little bit that they've had to deal with extra that they don't listen. They don't even listen to Moses. The first time they were excited. And yet they get more information, more details of what God is going to do. And this time they don't even listen. Now the good thing is God doesn't stop there, right? Even though they're discouraged, even though they don't listen to Moses, even though they're hanging their heads in sadness, God starts to carry out His plan. And they see these plagues one after the other. The first two, the magicians are able to do. The third one, the magicians can't do. And even they say, hey, this is the hand of God. And then about the fourth or fifth one, it quits being for the Israelites as well, and it's only the Egyptians. And they go through plague after plague after plague up till the ninth one. And they see that God is already treating them different than the Egyptians. He's already showing them mercy, and they're not having to go through these plagues. And then right before the 10th one, God tells them what He's going to do. And He tells them that the way you're going to be different, the way you're going to not be a part of this, is that you're going to obey this Passover. And you're going to do this for the rest of your time as a nation. You're going to do this for the rest. And it's going to be this sign that I did not pour out my wrath on you, that I loved you, that I chose you. And in this Passover, they had to sacrifice this spotless lamb, this innocent little lamb. They had to sacrifice this one, and they had to put its blood on the doorpost. And when the angel came through at night for this last and final plague, and it kills all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, when it sees the blood, when it sees that sign that these people are called by God, these people are following God, they are chosen and loved by God, that angel of death passes over their house. And they don't have to experience the tragedy of those who refuse to believe and obey God. And in the telling of this Passover, look how they respond. All the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. The plagues, it reminds them God is in control. God's got things. And they see all this and they're just so uplifted. And now, even though not that long ago they didn't even listen to Moses, now it says that all of them obeyed. They did exactly what Moses and Aaron said. And so sure enough, night comes. They hear the crying of all the Egyptians everywhere throughout the land. Everyone has lost their firstborn. And yet, their house is still standing. Nobody has died. And so, because of this, Pharaoh finally, he's like, all right, can't stand it, leave. Just get out of here. And God in His grace, not only do they leave with all the gold and all the goods of the Egyptians, and they go out and they head to the wilderness, and they're thinking, this is amazing. Not only are we getting free, they're giving us gifts as we go. And they go out and they're led to the edge of the sea. But Pharaoh, God hardens his heart one last time. And Pharaoh thinks, oh man, what am I doing? I just gave up my workforce, all of them. It doesn't matter how many kids they kill. We need them back. And so he gathers up the army and they chase them to the edge of the Red Sea. And the people of Israel see Pharaoh coming near with his army. They lift up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done bringing us out of Egypt? They've seen all the plagues. They've seen how their families were spared. And they still don't get it. They still don't get that whatever God wants to do, He can do. That if God tells them this plan and tells them it's going to happen, it's going to happen. You can take it to the bank. And here they stand at the edge of the Red Sea. And they're afraid. And they cry out. And Moses responds with this great statement that, just stand still because God is the one that's going to do this. If you hadn't figured it out yet, God is the one that's doing all this. You've done very little to this point. The Passover, yes, that was your first part in this, but God is the one that's doing everything. And so Moses stretches out his hand as God commands. And the seas part. And even though they thought they had no escape, there is this highway through the Red Sea leading to the other side. And so they go across. And Moses and all the people, their hearts are hard, and they're like, okay, they went, we can go. And so the people of Israel pass through, and then Pharaoh's army comes into the middle of the Red Sea. And once all the Israelites are out, Moses is commanded by God, and he takes down his staff, and all the water comes in and destroys every single one of the Egyptian army. Everyone that came out on foot to try to chase them and bring them back is now floating up on the riverbanks because they've died. And they sing this great song to God. Now they see it. Now they get it. Moses said it was going to happen. God is the one that's doing it. It's not us. We can't part the sea on our own. Everything that's happened is us obeying and doing what God has commanded. And they sing this song. I don't know why that's there. Israel saw the great power of the Lord before they sing. And so the people feared the Lord. And they believed in the Lord and His servant Moses. Now, right, they believe again. They're back on the train of Moses, but they sing this song. And two key parts in this I want you to see. The Lord is my strength and my song, and has become my salvation. And then later in verse 13 it says, you have led us in your steadfast love, the people whom you've redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. He says, we get it now. Right? We've done none of this. We're just as broken and flawed as the Egyptians are. We have our mistakes. We have our failures. But yet your love, your grace, your mercy, your covenant, that's how we're standing here today. That's how we're able to stand on the other side of this Red Sea with our enemies being destroyed. But the story doesn't end there. Next, they start walking through the wilderness. And it's not 3 days later, walking in the wilderness. The people grumbled. What shall we drink? We don't have any water. And it keeps going from there. The whole congregation grumble, and they say to Moses, what if we had died? Wow, What would it be that we die by the hand of the Lord in Egypt when we sat by these meat pots and ate bread to the full? For you have brought us out into the wilderness to die of hunger. We read it and it's almost silly, right? We read it and we're almost slapping ourselves in the head. What are they thinking? They just got done singing this song of how God loves them and cares for them and has brought them out. And it's not their doing, but it's God's. And yet 3 days in the wilderness, I'm thirsty. I'm hungry. I'd rather die back in Egypt where I had things to eat. I don't want to die of hunger. And it keeps going. And Moses actually tells them in chapter 16, don't you realize your grumbling is not against me? Hadn't you got it from this point? Moses is not the one doing these things. Moses is not the one that's carried out these plagues. Moses is not the one that's given you water from a rock. Moses is not the one that made bread fall from heaven. You're complaining against God. But yet, even after that, it's the same thing as what just happened. They're thirsty for water. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt? To kill us and our children with thirst. But thank goodness, the story doesn't end there. And they come to the foot of Mount Sinai and they encounter God, and God's presence comes down, and they have to learn of how to be careful around God's holiness. And they hear God speak through this cloud and this thunder. And God starts to lay out His plan, and He tells them the first 10, but then He speaks with Moses and He starts to tell them all this. And they come down and they ask, they say, all right, you've heard what God expects of you. Are y'all good with this? Or can we agree to this? In verse 3 of 24, it told all the people the words of the Lord. And the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken we will do. They experience God again, and here they are. They say, yes, we're on board again. Yes, and even I love the way these phrases are said. It's that the whole congregation of Israel, or in this case, they all spoke with one voice. Everybody is on board. Everybody is committed to this. And so after they agree to this covenant, Moses goes up on the mountain. And he gets more instructions from God. And God starts to lay out to build this tabernacle. God says, you know what? I want to live with my people. I want to be amongst them. I want them to be able to see my presence so they cannot go through this constant cycle of, is God there? Is God not? He says, no, I want to be there with them to assure them and to give them comfort that they know I'm in their presence. But unfortunately, while Moses is still up on the mountain, the golden calf happens. It's one of the silliest stories. When you look at how this all goes about, you just look at it and you're like, oh, you got to be kidding me. The Israelites did that? You got to be kidding me. Aaron said that? You just look at it and it seems like this comedy of errors. But the sad fact about it is it's true. Verse 1, it says, when the people saw that Moses delayed, he hasn't come down yet. The people gathered up and they said to Aaron, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses man who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. They still think Moses did it. They're still saying Moses brought us out of Egypt. And so right after that, he gets all the gold from everybody and he fashions it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. They start to sing and dance and they carry on about their lives. It's just that easy. Moses disappears and, hey, this golden calf that I just made with all the gold that y'all gave me, this is who brought you out of Egypt. This is your God. This is who you give credit to. Not that Yahweh that we haven't heard from in a couple of days. I don't know how long, right? Not that Yahweh. No, this calf. This is the one who did it all. The sad thing is, they heard the 10 Commandments. They heard the 10 words. They heard this. And yet, they broke the first 2. Immediately. Right? It's no surprise that when Moses comes down the mountain that he breaks the tablets, because that was the covenant. That was the agreement. If you signed a paper with somebody that says, hey, I'm going to give you this, you give me that, we're going to be nice to each other, whatever it is, and then as soon as you sign it, they turn around and they shoot a gun at you, or they throw all your money back in your face, whatever. You would say, well, this covenant is worthless. You couldn't even obey it for 30 seconds. That's the exact response that Moses has. He comes down and he sees that they're worshiping this calf. And he's like, well, this is useless now. The sad thing about this, I don't know how that got hit. The sad thing about this, it's already told you. We're the people of Israel. We make these same silly mistakes. We try to, I'm just going to set this down. It's very sensitive today. We do all these same things. We give credit for things that God has done to other things. If God starts to build up this church, if God starts to fill this room and we have 300 or 400, there's inevitably going to be some of us that'll say, well, it's because we added TVs in the classroom. It's because we did more things with our technology, or we did a better job of this or a better job of that. Even God's people make these same mistakes. We give credit to things that aren't God. But the reality is, God from the very beginning has been the one doing it all. We can say, oh, it's because of this person or that person. They did the same thing. No, it's Moses that led us out of Egypt. No, it's not. Moses just obeyed God. God is the one that led them out of Egypt. God's grace has been there all along. When you look at Hosea 11, where I keep wanting to click to, starting in verse 1, this is what God says about the people. Long after all this has happened, this is how God speaks of what happened. He says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt. He refers to us as children, because let's be honest, some of the things the Israelites did was acting like children. Well, mom's not around, I'm going to make this calf. Or I'm going to be afraid and think that, mom's forgot about me, that sort of thing. He says we're like children. But yet He called us out of Egypt. The more that they were called, the more that they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. He says, I've showed them how to take step after step after step. I took them up by their arms when they did not know that I healed them. He said they didn't even know that it was me doing it, but I'm the one doing it. I led them with cords of kindness, with bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws. And I bent down to them and I fed them. When God looks back at this story of the Israelites coming out of Egypt, He says, look, I showed them grace. I showed them mercy. I showed them kindness. I showed them love. I helped them to take every single step. And we saw it, right? Every time, hey, yeah, God did something good. We're on board. And then toughness hits. Nope. Where's my water? Where's my food? Just like a child. But yet God let us out because of His great love that He has for us. Because of His great grace. Now, I couldn't get through the book of Exodus without this one beautiful proclamation. We didn't get to talk about the story of Moses. We didn't really get to trace his path through all this. But when God is testing Moses, and He calls him up on, Moses comes up on the mountain, and Moses wants to see His presence. He wants to be close to God as he can be, because even he is afraid that God is now going to just say, nope, never mind. I tried to make this covenant, and yet you broke it before I could even finish writing it. And Moses is afraid. And he says, God, I want to see your presence. And so God agrees, and he does this really weird thing. And like I say, we can't get into it. But He speaks His name. And then after this comes this beautiful proclamation. in chapter 34 and verse 5, he says, the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with Moses there and proclaimed the name. Verse 6, the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who by no means will clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. You know, like I say, we don't see this word a lot in the Old Testament, but boom, here it is. It says that He is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and we saw that. But the part that I love about this is that His love is for thousands, but yet His anger and His justice is for 3 or 4. You know, think about that. That's what we see, is that no, by no means God is not going to forgive when people make mistakes. He can't. In fact, who would want to be around somebody that's just constantly saying, "Oh, it's no big it's no big deal that Pharaoh murdered hundreds and thousands of kids. That's not a big deal. It's not a big deal if he, continues to oppress these people that live within us." We don't want that sort of God. God by no means is going to lay down justice because of His love. But yet it says His love lasts longer than His anger. God's going to be angry for 3 or 4 generations, but yet His love goes on for thousands. This is the grace that God tries to show to us. This is the mercy that He shows to us. He's not going to let sin go unpunished, but His mercy is truly unending. His grace, we truly can find no limit to. And we see that in our story as we were called out of Egypt. That even though we act like children, even though we make mistakes, God is full of steadfast love and faithfulness. So if you're here today and you're not a Christian, start that walk with Him. We've all been at that point where we realize we're not living the way that we need to be. And we start to believe and we understand that God's truth really is truth, that what He created us for is absolutely what we were meant to do. If you're willing to confess Jesus as your Lord, turn from your sinful lifestyle, be baptized, and become a new creation. And God will lead you by His hand to follow Him so that you can be with Him forever. Or if you're here and you're a Christian, you need the prayers of the church. Come as we stand and sing.